Hello. So today we have chapter 20. This week we have two chapters, 20 and 21, somatic senses and motor control, and then we're going to get into special senses. So this one's a little shorter than the other one. The other one's a little longer, a little more in depth. But pretty much is continuing with the brain, continuing with the spinal cord, and kind of how we perceive what we perceive. And how when we perceive some change around us, some stimulus, we smell something, we hear something, we touch something, where it travels through or what kind of receptors are there that send it to what parts of the brain. Okay, so I have my book right here on the side, and there's a lot of new vocab. I believe there's a lot of words that we probably haven't heard of before, so that may make it a little more confusing. So feel free to pause it and kind of look a little more in depth on your book, on those specific parts. I feel like that's the hardest part of these couple of chapters. Just some vocabulary words that are, even to me, are not super common that I'll use in my classroom or throughout. So that makes it a little more challenging, at least to me. So just keep that in mind. And again, feel free to pause it and follow me. I'm on page 718. Okay, on chapter 20. So let's do this. Okay, so definition of sensation. So it is a conscious or subconscious awareness of some sort of change, either outside or inside our body. Okay, so in order for this sensation to occur, there has to be a stimulus. A stimulus is some sort of change. There has to be a receptor that senses that change. So every time you say sensory, just think about sensing it or noticing it. There has to be some sort of conduction, or the sensing of that change needs to send a nerve impulse through a conduction, or a neural pathway that sends it to the brain. And then there has to be some sort of integration or processing of that signal. Okay, so again, use those kind of words and kind of, to me, is like not dumbing them down, but simplifying them to easier vocabulary words. So there's some sort of change. I notice it somehow, and then through some pathway, I send it to the brain to process it. Okay, so those are the four conditions that must be satisfied. Okay, so we have perception, we have sensory modality, and we have adaptation. Okay, so I think we'll get into. Okay, so just going back, perception is that conscious interpretation of that change. So just perceiving something's happening. Sensory modality is that each unique type of sensation has its own receptors. Okay, that's sensory modality, just one specific one. And adaptation is just that decrease in a sensation during a prolonged stimulus. So after you sense something through time, your body's gonna adapt to create a change towards that, whatever change that was, whatever they sensed. Okay. So it can be grouped into general senses or special senses. And the general senses is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. Somatic, remember, soma means body. So somatic is senses around the body, like on the outside of the body. And visceral is like organs. Okay, so there can be some changes that we sense in our organs where we got to send signals to the brain to do something about it, to process it and send signals back. Special senses are when we get into smell, taste, vision, hearing, and balance. Okay, so those are a little more in depth. Again, it's another chapter. So, sensory receptors. So let's get into sensory receptors. They can be grouped into three ways. We have structures of their sensory receptors. We have the structure of it, the type of it, and the location of it. Okay, so it's kind of, I don't know if you remember, I think it was chapter 1 or chapter 2 when we got about cells, and we have like how they were organized and kind of the shape they were and kind of the length or where the cell was. So how you have like simple cuboidal or simple squamous epithelial. So the type of tissues, right? So just sensory receptors. It's either a structure, a type of stimulus, or a location, and that's kind of how you identify them. Okay. So we have what's called free nerve endings. So if you can see in our chapter, I think it's figure 20.1. I don't know if I have it here. There it is. Okay, we'll get to it right now. But basically, kind of like the little free nerve endings are on the outside. We have encapsulated nerve endings, so nerve endings, but have a little capsule on it. So lower frequency vibrations, and then we have some separate cells that you'll see around it. Um, that's kind of the structure: the free nerve, encapsulated, or separate cells. Okay. Then we have the stimulus, the type of stimulus they detect. So it can be photoreceptors, so you can talk about light. It can be mechanoreceptors, that's like touch or pressure. Thermal, that would be heat. Osmo, that would be like fluids. Chemo, that would be different chemicals in our body. And gnosis, I don't know how it's nociceptors. Nociceptors. I guess that's how it says it on the book. Okay. Noci is harmful, so responds to like painful stimuli. Okay. Then we can also have location of those: extero, intero, or propio. Okay. So extero is like the external body. Intero is more like the visceral or visceral receptors, like inside our organs. And propio, that will be more of one's own. So that means like our muscles, our tendons, our joints, kind of those areas. Okay. So remember, we talked about the structure, we talked about the type of stimulus, and we talked about the location. Okay, so all of those will determine the type of sensory receptor you have. Table 20.1 kind of has a good little kind of description or chart of all that information, so that's a good one to have, kind of which ones they are and kind of their description of each. Okay, so again, here's a picture. We have those little free nerve endings. Okay, we have like capsulated, right in here. So non-encapsulated, capsulated. Here's our hair root plexus. So here's our other senses more down. Laminated corpuscle, so high frequency vibrations, or also a little deeper in the skin. Right. This one's more like embedded through the skin, the bulbous corpuscle. So that one is gonna, like, once the skin stretches, it's gonna sense that stretching. So it's just kind of, they're placed, and this is pretty cool. Like, they're placed on specific areas to detect a specific change, which is pretty cool. So, okay. So, we are 20.2, somatic sensations. Okay. So somatic sensations are sensations in the body, somatic, that arise from the stimulation of those sensory receptors that are embedded in the skin or the subcutaneous layer, in the mucous membranes, which can be in the mouth, in the vagina, or in the anus, in the muscles, tendons, or joints, or in the inner ear. And then there's also cutaneous sensation. So if you think about cutaneous, you think about skin, right? The skin surface. So cutaneous sensation or subcutaneous sensations. Okay. So we got tactile sensations. Okay. So touch, pressure, vibration, itching, tickling. Those are the tactile sensations. We're gonna start with touch. So we're gonna talk a little about it. It talks about a little bit. It talks about a couple of them. Sorry, I'm trying to talk too fast and I get my head kind of stuck. It talks about touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle. I just dropped my book on my iPad. But okay, so we'll start with touch. So we have what are called tactile corpuscles. If you think about it, they're like touch receptors, kind of like at the end of dermal papillae. Then you have hair root plexus, so those are receptors kind of in the hair roots. We have non-encapsulated sensory, and then we have those bulbous or Ruffini corpuscles. So I think we kind of go back. So these are bulbous, right? Non-encapsulated. So that's more like fine touch and pressure, right? So that's touch. Then we have also thermal sensations. So that's these thermal receptors that detect temperature changes, and those are free nerve endings, like the one we have up here. Free nerve endings, cold or warm, comes right here on the little top. Okay. There's two distinct thermal sensations, either cold or warm, and they're detected by either cold receptors or warm receptors. So it's pretty selfish. I'm glad they kept those normal words that we use, right? They didn't use some fancy words to just say cold or warm. Okay. Then we also have what are called pain sensations. So pain is indispensable for survival, right? I think we talked about it last week or the week before, but think about if you didn't feel pain, and all of a sudden you put your hand on the stove that's on fire, you'd just be like, blah 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 blah. and your hand would be getting on fire. Like you would need to feel pain to understand that there's something going on, there's something wrong. Um, Personal example, I play baseball, and I know a lot of baseball players take, I don't know if you've seen it or anybody, or even in any sport, like soccer or whatever, where you get to leagues and maybe your parents or uncles or anything like that, and they start putting all these, what's it called? All these like lotions in their body to keep it warm or like icy hot, and like they start taking pills so their arm doesn't hurt or their knees don't hurt. So they're starting to take all these pills so they don't feel any pain as they play. But personally, I hated that because I would never know how much I can take or how far I can take my body. And even after I injured my shoulder, I still played a little bit of baseball. And they would always tell me, "Here's put this on, and then take this 3 of these pills so you don't feel anything and you can pitch the whole game." But like, no, because as soon as I know it's hurting, then I have to stop. I can't just keep going and going and tear whatever I have on my body. So pain is indispensable for survival. We need to feel pain. So we got pain sensations. So it's kind of like a protective function by kind of signaling our brain and our body what's going on, what's happening, what we need to fix, what we need to do, and to run away or get out of it, right? And those are the nociceptors. The book, remember we talked about tactile or like touch. I talked about touch, pressure, and vibration and itch, and maybe you want to read a little more into that. But I just went from tactile to thermal to pain. Okay, and there's different types of pain: fast pain, slow pain, deep somatic pain, visceral pain in our organs, right? So depending on where the pain is kind of receptors you're gonna have, or pain receptors. Okay. Um, oh, there it is. I got ahead of myself. We got fast, slow, superficial, somatic, so body, superficial in the body, deep somatic, so deeper in the body, and visceral, kind of in the organs. Okay. Referred pain is kind of the area around where it's gonna hurt. So if you think about, I don't know, you have a cool picture. There it is. Okay, so you have a cool picture. You have all this referred pain in red. So if kind of that area hurts, that means most likely the receptors in the heart are kind of signaling some sort of issue around that area. Um, I remember my sister would always say like, "Oh my God, my arm is hurting. I'm probably gonna have a heart attack." Like she always, I don't know. Someone told her that apparently when her left arm hurts, then it's most likely a heart attack. But not always. Sometimes it's something bit you or something like that. But anyways, so you have different areas where that's referred pain, where it's gonna hurt, and it's kind of the general area of maybe there's a deeper issue, but that's where the area kind of where you feel the pain, right? Right? Have you heard of the kidneys as well, where kind of like your lower back hurts a little bit? Oh, it's probably the kidneys. You probably need to drink water. So there's different referred pain or different areas that hurt, where the issue may be more internal than superficial. Okay, again, if I go too fast, let me know. Proprioceptive sensations. Okay, so or proprioception, so like one's own self or one's own sensations. Okay, they allow us to recognize that the body parts belong to us. Kind of how we can move with our eyes closed and know that I'm touching my nose, I'm touching my ears, recognizing that that's where my body is. Kind of those areas. All right. We have kinesthesia, the perception of the body movements. We have what are called proprioceptors. Um, they're kind of in our muscles, especially postural muscles, to kind of having posture, and tendons to tell us how muscles are contracted or not. And then we have also proprioceptors allow for weight discrimination. So we keep a little bit of balance and assess weight of an object. So if you pick up a dumbbell to know kind of how much you need to contract depending on the weight you get. So those receptors will tell us how much our muscle needs to contract. So for us bodybuilders, we got a lot of those. Nah, not me. I need to start working out more. Okay, then we have muscle spindles. Okay, so those are the proprioceptors that are in those muscles or in the skeletal muscles. Um, the muscle tone is kind of the degree of that contraction of the muscle. We have intrafusal muscle fibers. We have gamma motor neurons. Remember, we talked about motor and sensory, so coming either to the muscle or to the brain, or to the periphery or to the brain. Motor, sensory, okay. Gamma motor neurons, extrafusal muscle fibers, and alpha motor neurons. And I think there's a picture somewhere in here, which we'll get to the picture right now. But Tendon organs and joint kinesthetic receptors. So our tendons, our tendon organs protect tendons and their muscles from damage due to extra muscle tension. And this makes sense. So these receptors are going to tell us, all right, that's enough. Stop stretching or we're going to rip in half. Like, we need to stop. So those are little tendon organs that are kind of in there telling us, sensing when we need to stop stretching so we don't have some injury. Okay, so several types of those kinesthetic receptors are present within and around the articular capsules of synovial joints. So here's a picture. So here's a little tendon organ kind of here near the tendons, between the tendon and the muscle. So if you think about when the muscle stretches, it also stretches that little tendon. So it's able to tell us when we need to stop, right? So blue will be to the central nervous system. So those are sensory, remember, to our brain. And then red from the central nervous system. So those will be our motor neurons, alpha motor neurons, gamma motor neurons coming down to our muscle from our brain, so telling us what to do. Okay, here's intrafusal, or a little more inside, extrafusal muscle fibers on the outside, sensory nerve endings as well that we have, so they can send that sensory information to the brain. Right? Muscle spindle capsule coming around. Okay. So there's a good little chart as well, table 20.2, the different receptor types and then kind of where they are. So for example, hair root plexus, so free nerve endings around hair follicles, bulbous corpuscles, deep in the dermis, on the skin, ligaments and tendons, warm receptors and cold, so kind of in the skin, mucous membranes that we talked about, nociceptors in the body tissue except the brain, proprioceptors, muscle spindles, tendon organs. So it's a good little chart if you want to kind of go back and review a little bit or kind of read it right now. Okay, and it gives you adaptation rate and kind of sensations, kind of what it's going to sense. Okay, 20.3, somatic sensory pathways. So a group of neurons in series, so these pathways, so a group of these neurons in a series, kind of steps that convey sensory information from those body sensory receptors, from our somatic sensory receptors, to the primary somatosensory cortex, and the postcentral gyrus. So back to our brain, in the parietal lobe of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Okay. So I posted actually it's over there. I should keep my brain a little bit, but anyways. So we have the pathway. So we have basically in order: first order, second order, third order. Makes sense, right? I'm just happy when sometimes these words and these structures like so easy to memorize, or just okay, first, second, and third, instead of just first and then something random, and then fourth. Like, just makes it easier for us. So first order neurons, second order neurons, third order neurons. Okay. So first order on the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, that get the information. Second order are kind of in the brainstem or spinal cord, and then the third order in the somatosensory cortex area, more up there. Okay. And to send those signals up into our brain, we have two general pathways where our body sensing signals enter the spinal cord and go up to the cerebral cortex. I always try to simplify that wording, and it makes it easier for me to understand. And if I just read it in that language or that vocab, it's a little harder. So we have two pathways: posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, and we have anterolateral spinothalamic pathway. Okay, so those are our two pathways. And there's a picture which we'll see. So we have the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. Oh, man, that's a mouthful. Okay, so it comes from the name of the two white matter tracks, okay, that we're gonna see in the posterior area, and then it goes through the medial lemniscus up to the cortex, and we have what are called gracial fasciculus and cunate fasciculus. If you remember a little fasciculus, you have our little kind of like our vertebrae, and kind of like in the back of the area. There's a picture on the last chapter that kind of sticks out a little bit, and you'll see it right now. But here it is. Okay, so here's our little fasciculus, kind of in the back. Okay, so posterior column, gracial fasciculus, cunate fasciculus. So just follow the pathway. Okay. Posterior column, so posterior area column, medial lemniscus pathway. Okay, So we have right here we have a receptor for touch, pressure, vibration, whatever we sense, to the spinal nerve, right? Sensory nerves coming up. It goes through the gracial fasciculus, right, and the cunate fasciculus. So the signals coming up, the gracial nucleus and cunate nucleus. Then it goes to our second order neurons, so it changes color. So first order neurons, the blue ones. Second order, those purple ones, through the medial lemniscus. And then it goes back into the third order neurons, which are the green ones, to the primary somatosensory cortex of our cerebrum. Okay, somato, body sensing cortex or area of the cerebrum of the brain, or the top part of the brain. Okay, see, when you simplify it, it makes a little more sense. But so this is a posterior column medial lemniscus, and then when you have the anterolateral, so the anterior and kind of on the side lateral. That's see how this one is kind of lateral spinal thalamic tract. So first order, second order, third order as well. But this one's more lateral, anterior spinal thalamic tract and the lateral spinal thalamic tract. So an anterolateral pathway. You see the flow from this one from one side, while this one has one of each side. Okay. So the lumbar is a little on the bottom, and the cervical is a little higher. Okay, so those are basically our two little pathways of how we sense some change or stimulus and we send it to our brain. Okay. So we talked about that, lateral spinal thalamic, anterior spinal thalamic tract. Okay, now mapping. This one's actually pretty funny. Like, I don't know why, but I see this picture and it always like reminds me of like these Picasso drawings, or whenever I saw that in high school or even in college. It seemed pretty funny, but it basically explains where in our brain we're going to receive the signals from those areas. Okay, so if you look at here, the coronal section of the primary somatosensory cortex in the right cerebral hemisphere, and coronal section of the primary motor cortex. All right, so sending it back. Okay, in the right cerebral hemisphere. So you have kind of the area of the somatosensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus. And you'll see kind of in this area we have hip sensors, trunk, neck, head, shoulder, arm, forearm, upper lips over here, intra-abdominal, kind of near the bottom. So just kind of explains this mouth is a little funny vocalization. So sending signals back to us to talk, right? We need more. And you think about it, this kind of makes sense. Just thinking about it right now, thinking out loud. You need more of an area to send signals, to talk more, to sing, to salivate, than you need to sense what's in my mouth. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like there's more that goes from the brain to our mouth than what goes from our mouth to the brain. If that makes sense. So you see kind of like a bigger area right here on the motor cortex than on the sensory cortex, right? Because this is going to the brain, this is coming from the brain. So it's a little more specific in areas, while this one kind of gets a broader range. But anyways, I was just thinking out loud. Okay, somatic sensory pathways to the cerebellum. Okay, so there's a table 20.3 that has kind of all those pathways: posterior column medial lemniscus, anterolateral pathway, and the spinal cerebral pathway. So anterior spinal cerebral and posterior spinal cerebral. So they're the ones that get signals from the trunk and lower limbs of one side of the body to the same side of the cerebellum. So coming up. Okay. What else? Let's see. Somatic motor pathways. So we are on 20.4. Okay. So again, feel free to pause it and go back to that little table. I think it's on page 731. But now we are at 20.4. Somatic motor pathway. So we have what are called lower motor neurons. Okay. We have 4 groups of those neurons that participate in the control of that movement. So we have what's called local circuit, upper motor, corpus striatum, and cerebellar. Okay. So those are our 4. So lower circuit. I don't know if it explains it. No. Okay. Try not to. Okay. So local circuit, they help coordinate rhythmic activity, muscle groups, flexion, extension of the lower limbs while we walk. Okay. Then we have our upper motor neurons, where there's direct motor pathways or indirect motor pathways. So those are come from the brainstem. Remember, motor is coming from the brain to our body. Come from the brainstem and regulate posture, balance, muscle tone, and movements of the head and the trunk. I don't know if it has the other. Corpus striatum. So they help initiate and terminate movements, suppress unwanted movements, and give us a normal muscle tone as well. And then cerebellar neurons maintain posture and balance. Okay. Okay. So we have somatic. Where is it at? Motor pathways. So those are the upper motor neurons that we talked about, direct or indirect. And then we have direct motor pathways, so nerve impulses for voluntary movements. They come from the cerebral cortex to the lower motor neurons through direct motor pathways, also known as pyramidal pathways. Okay, and I think, yeah, we're on page 733. Okay, so it's split it into two different ones: cortical spinal, the pathway. So we have lateral cortical spinal and anterior cortical spinal, and I think there's a picture as well in there. And then we have cortical bulbar pathways. Okay. Okay. So I think, yeah, here's a picture. Cool. So we have, remember, we're starting in our brain, right? Coming down. Signals are coming down from the cerebrum. We have our upper motor neurons, right? The pyramidal, because there's like a little pyramid here, and it kind of goes down through the anterior cortical spinal tract and back to our lower motor neurons, right? So here's our anterior cortical spinal, and here's our left lateral cortical spinal tract as well, coming down to our lower motor neurons. So kind of just a movement through that pathway of getting a signal in our brain and sending it to our muscles to do whatever we want them to do. Okay. So those were direct. If you see that, it's just pretty straightforward, pretty direct. And then we have what's called indirect pathways. Okay, so those are also called extrapyramidal. We have the rubrospinal tract, tectospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, medial reticulospinal tract, lateral reticulospinal tract. Okay, rubrospinal, it goes from the red nucleus to the contralateral muscles. Okay, and I have precise voluntary movements of distal parts of the limbs. We have the tectospinal. So we have reflexive movement of the head and the eyes. Vestibulospinal. So that's from the vestibular nucleus. And that will be to the trunk, the free limbs, giving posture and balance. And then we have lateral and medial reticulospinal. Okay, those ipsilateral skeletal muscles of the trunk, proximal parts of the free limbs, keep posture, regulate muscle tone, ongoing body movements. Okay. All right, so we have the corpus striatum. Okay. It influences the movement through the effects of the upper motor neurons. Okay, and this corpus striatum will initiate and terminate movements. It will suppress unwanted movements. It will control muscle tone, and it will influence cortical function. Okay. It will regulate emotional behaviors as well. So we have the corpus striatum kind of helping start all those movements, terminate those movements, suppress some movements we don't want to, control a couple of the muscle tone that we have. And then, so that's a corpus striatum. The cerebellum, on the other hand, will monitor intentions for the movement. We're like, why are we doing this? They will monitor the actual movement that we're doing. It will compare command signals with the sensory information, so the one that's coming up there, making sure it's correct what we're sending out, and send out corrective feedback. So if we send information to do something and our brain wants to send a signal out, it will correct that feedback that we sent and make sure we have the right movement in our body or in our muscles. Okay, and then the brainstem, okay, its role in movement itself as well. So we have the vestibular nuclei, will be for postural reflexes to make sure posture. Reticular formation in the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The superior colliculus in that midbrain. They have saccades and gay centers, and then the red nucleus in our midbrain as well. So this is kind of when we talk about Parkinson's disease, getting into those areas that we really can't control, or people can't control, right? And there's a couple of different clinical connections throughout different pathways that you're going to see. We saw ALS as well when we think about direct motor pathways as well. So we really can't control those motor pathways. Those are pretty interesting if you want to get into those. Okay. Where we at? I think I went. Okay. 20.5. I think we're almost done. Integration of sensory input and motor output. Okay. Sensory information is integrated to the brain. The brain does not necessarily respond to every single input that's sent, and it can happen both conscious or subconsciously. Okay. So it's just basically telling us that we send a lot of signals to our brain that it doesn't always respond the way it has to, or doesn't respond to every single information that's being sent. So we have to process it. We have to make sure, well, our brain has to make sure the signals that are being sent out are correct as well. And it can be conscious or be subconscious. You don't always think of reacting certain ways, so that's good. It's good we have receptors that will send signals subconsciously, so nothing happens to our bodies, keeping us from harm, which is pretty cool. We gotta survive, adapt, and survive. So, all right, that's the last one, first video, and I'll post another one in a little bit.